All right, thank you everybody for joining us for another video of Left the Chat. I just want to remind the audience of what we discussed briefly last time. We talked about Marx's chapter 3 on the money commodity and its various forms. And the most important thing to remember from that chapter leading up to the chapters we're going to talk about today is the fact that money has this property that ends up coming into being, which is that people end up hoarding it. And the reason they end up hoarding it is because there are many commodities like housing and car payments and other things like that that require people to save money in the present in order to meet those obligations in the future. And because of that, people have to end up hoarding large quantities of money to meet those obligations. So those hoards end up kind of sowing the seeds of capital, which is what we're actually going to talk about this week. I'll leave it up to Jay to give us that introduction to chapter 4.
Right, so that leads us into part 2 of capital, which is the transformation of money into capital. And that part 2 includes chapters 4, 5, and 6. So starting with 4 is the formula of capital. So it's important to note that not all money is capital. Money that follows that Cmc circulation, that is when you're just buying commodities with money, it isn't capital. However, if it follows the MCM circulation, it's converted into capital and emerges through that process. So again, the MCM process, M to C means that you're purchasing, and C to M means that you're selling. So the distinction between that CMC and MCM is that the CMC end goal, that is commodity money to commodity, is the use value of the commodity being bought. And then when you take the MCM form, then it's the exchange value that you're gaining in the end. So for example, selling a coat in order to acquire sunglasses, when talking about the CMC circuit, you don't want the use value of a coat, but you want the use value of the glasses. So you sell the coat, you get money, and then you buy glasses. So you're just getting a different use value. So the exchange value is mostly equal in in that exchange. A qualitatively different use value is desired. So alternatively, that MCM circuit, the end goal is more money. So buying sunglasses for $15 and then selling them for $20, you have a quantitatively rather than a qualitatively different use value. You have a quantitatively different exchange value being desired. So why then the exchange, why then in that form of exchange do you end up with the same amount of money value at the end? Maybe that last question didn't make sense, but if you want to jump in there, Steve.
Sure. Let me rescue you here for a second.
Yeah, please.
So I just want to also point out one very important thing, and a very easy way I think to distinguish the two circuits is that in CMC, your end goal is consumption. At the end of the day, you are trying to, like you said, take a commodity. Like I think Marx uses various times in chapter 3, the example of like the Bible salesman who ends up selling his Bibles for money to then go to the local liquor store to buy liquor for it. So his end goal was the satisfaction of his desire for liquor. So at the end of the goal, he's turning his commodity that he started with, in this case, the Bibles, into money, but he's consuming it in the form of purchasing another commodity, in this case, a use value that's useful to him. Whereas in MCM, the end goal, like you stated previously, was money, and which is basically money ends up being the goal in and of itself. It's no longer just the vehicle to purchase commodities. It becomes the actual goal. To kind of distinguish it, again, another good way to distinguish it is that the CMC circuit has use value at its goal at the end, whereas MCM or M delta, right, at the end, because you end up with more money, which is, just for the audience, that he symbolizes that with like an M apostrophe to symbolize M delta, which means you end up with more money. The end goal of that process is exchange value.
So essentially, like, why then exchange something just to end up with the same amount of money at the end? You want to gain something. So buying sunglasses for $15 and then selling them for $20, you gain that that $5. So Marx mentions this MCM circuit, M delta, you call it, other people call it M prime, and it's a little tilde at the top of the second M, and that M prime equals M plus money plus surplus value. And this is the first time that Marx mentions the concept of surplus value. And to quote Marx, he says, "The value originally advanced, therefore, not only remains intact while in circulation, but adds to itself a surplus value or expands itself. It is this movement that converts it into capital." So this is Marx's first now describing how capital forms out of that MCM prime process. And capital to Marx is this process rather than just a stock of assets. A lot of classical economists and a lot of economists today define capital as just, a stock of assets like machines, money, etc., as it's traditionally understood. But Marx describes this process as how capital comes into being.
Yeah, and that is always a very good thing to point out about Marx, is that he's always defining it as a process, something in motion, not something static, which is, again, one of the biggest things that I kind of enjoy about him, is that he's not this kind of static equilibria kind of theorist. Another thing that I kind of wanted to bring up, which I just thought was interesting, was that Marx kind of starts the chapter by pointing out that a lot of capital in its original form actually came about through merchants' capital and usurers' capital. So, merchants is the idea of what kind of the example you just gave, right? Of like, but purchasing sunglasses, $15, and then turning around and selling it for 20. So that would be considered merchants' capital, though, because it's not productive. You're not creating any new value there. You just took something, and then in the case of historically, right? You had these merchants that left England, went to China, bought silk for whatever, 100 pounds. And then when it was really valued much higher, right? Let's say 500 pounds per 20 yards of silk or something. And then they would come to England and actually sell it at its value, and then, pocket the difference. So he makes this, he specifically talks about this to point out that he acknowledges, yes, this is, this form of capital exists, but it's not really capital in the way I'm defining it. And this isn't productive form of capital. It doesn't really create value. You're just stealing value. And he also describes usurers' capital, which, again, for people that don't know, is the idea of essentially selling money, right, for interest. You let people borrow money for a premium on it. So it's even worse in that kind of circuit. It's not even MCM. It's literally just M to M prime. That's it. And it was always demonized throughout history because of that kind of fact. But a really important part here is that these merchants and these usurers were the foundations for capital, these hoards. They accumulated these hoards through this method of accumulating capital, and then ended up using it to finance industrial capital, which is what Marx wants to focus on, right? The factory, which we'll get into in later chapters. But I thought it was very important to bring that up because, just the fact that he acknowledges it, and he acknowledges the historical precedent that it had to set as a way to finance industrial production. Right.
So just to reiterate again that when money is in that CMC circulation, it isn't capital. So money ceases to be capital if it's spent on consumption. So if you take that $20 you earned from selling the sunglasses and you use it to purchase a book, then the $20 is only money again. It's no longer capital. If it's kept and it's spent on what we'll talk about later, the means of production or employment, then it's used as capital.
Oh, and another important thing that he defines here, which is just to give a name to this thing, this is the first time in this chapter 4, where he uses the word valorization, and it's literally just the process by which money is converted into capital. That's all. Mm-hmm. But I just want to point it out because he ends up using that word like from here on out, like describe that.
Right. One quote that Harvey gives in his companion guide is with regards to money ceasing to be capital if it's spent on consumption. He says, I could make capital right now by taking money out of my pocket and putting it into circulation to make more money, or I could take capital out of circulation simply by choosing to put the money back into my pocket. It then follows that not all money is capital. Capital is money being used in a certain way. So I think that last sentence, capital is money being used in a certain way, really sums up Marx's idea of that MCM circuit. So the capitalist is the one that takes part in the MCM circuit, and they produce use values only in order to gain exchange value through that production process, because their goal at the end is, of course, more money. And that MCM tilde or MCM prime can then effectively be done indefinitely. There's this limitless growth of capital, and that's kind of the idea behind the system of capitalism, is that it has this limitless growth, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah, which is a major implication that he starts to explore here. So that unlike commodities that perish or go bad, or like whatever, they have like some sort of physical limit on the amount you can produce. Money doesn't have that. So
Mhm.
you just you can accumulate large hoards of money. And I like this. There's a page 254 for chapter 4, which is, remember that Marx is always thinking about social groups and social relations. So this is the first time he actually defines like what a capitalist is. And to your point, he's this guy who primarily works in that MCM circuit, but he kind of defines here a behavioral ethos, if you will, about what a capitalist is. So he quotes here, the capitalist, his aim is rather the unceasing movement of profit making, the boundless drive for enrichment. This passionate chase after value is common to the capitalist and the miser. So again, he's kind of defining here his modus operandi as the ever accumulation of more and more money, essentially.
Right. So essentially that's chapter 4. The summary basically boils down to capital develops through this MCM prime process for the purpose at the end of acquiring more money itself. And that's really the whole circuit there, which then leads us into chapter 5, where he talks with the title of the chapter being Contradictions in the General Formula of Capital. And he explains here, where is that surplus value in M prime coming from? Why, if you're selling these sunglasses for $20 and getting that $5 in profit, where does that $5 in profit come from, right? If the MCM without the prime is equivalent, then surplus value can't be derived simply from that exchange. There needs to be some other element, which we'll talk about also leading into chapter 6, but he talks about these contradictions in chapter 5.
Yeah, and I think to kind of sum up this chapter, because it's a pretty small chapter, but I'm gonna quote something that he says on page 263, I believe, because to succinctly say, he kind of goes through these various thought experiments, kind of outlining why you can't get surplus value as he defines it through the exchange of commodities, through that thing you just described. Like he's proving to us why you can't take 2,000 pounds of cotton and then just sell it because you purchased it somewhere else and then resell it to get something, and that's how you get surplus value. Because how he defines the exchange of commodities in the previous chapters, remember it's always an exchange of equivalents, right? Remember the 20 yards of linen is worth 20, a certain amount of gold, so you can't, get more out of it. It's worth a certain thing. So again, like to your point, like how can you do this? So one really quick thought experiment, I think that would sum this up, is when he says, let us assume that a seller is able to sell his commodities above their value, to sell what is worth 100 for 110. In this case, he pockets the surplus value of $10, but after he has sold, he becomes a buyer. Then a third owner of commodities now comes to him as a seller, and he too, for his part, enjoys the privilege of selling his commodities at 10% more. Our friend has gained $10 as a seller, only to lose it again as a buyer. In fact, the net result is that all owners of commodities sell their goods to each other at 10% above their value, which is the same as if they sold it at their value. So he's here pointing out that, this is why you can't get money, or you can't get surplus value out of exchange, because people are just, you're just gaming each other. And it ends up all balancing out at the end. But I want to point out that he is making kind of one assumption here, where he's kind of assuming that everybody in the market has perfect information. And perfect information is this concept in economics where all the consumers and the producers have perfect and instant knowledge of all market prices, their own utility, and all this. Basically, have answer to all the information. Like they know how much cotton is selling over in Yorkshire, even though they're selling in London. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's kind of like what we discussed previously, that his whole theory is kind of relies on the market being in perfect equilibrium, and it's unrealistic, right? To theorize in that sense. But I mean, the theory has to come from somewhere. So in that same vein, like what you said, it's kind of unrealistic to assume that everybody has this perfect information.
Right. I just wanted to bring that up for the audience because, like you said, we're always kind of like questioning Marx's assumptions, or at least pointing them out so that people are aware of like the assumptions that he's making. But that I think pretty much sums up that chapter for the most part.
He
going through that is just saying, this can't really happen in exchange like this. Which when you start off with like where's surplus value coming from? It's not coming from people just gaming each other in the market.
And it's important to point out that this surplus value is only available to the capitalist. We'll talk about now the difference between a capitalist and a worker or a laborer. But he kind of leaves us on a cliffhanger in chapter 5, which he'll immediately answer in the title of chapter 6. But the cliffhanger being, where does this surplus value come from? Which leads us into chapter 6, the buying and selling of labor power. So boom, that's the answer. It comes from labor power. And he answers the question that I just asked in chapter 5, right there in the title. The surplus value doesn't just appear in the money or in the exchange process, since exchange is typically equivalent. The only place left for that surplus value to exist is within the commodity itself, within that production process. And he specifically brings up the concept of labor power creating that surplus value.
Yeah. No, I mean, to just kind of like bounce off what you said, this chapter is where Marx kind of makes his conclusion, right? Like, okay, so where does surplus value come from? It's coming from labor, because the capitalist is looking for a very special commodity, right? And he can't find the commodity on the market that can somehow get more value than what it's worth, right? You can't, unless you are, again, gaming the market, you can't get more for something that's worth technically $20, and you can't just magically get $30 out of it or $10 extra. So what he's trying to find is a special commodity that is able to valorize, and that commodity is labor.
And labor power, I mean, it sounds pretty obvious what labor power consists of, but just to kind of give it a little more weight to it, that labor power consists of the physical, mental, and human capacities to congeal value in the commodities. So it's what creates that surplus value. So essentially, capitalists employ people to apply their labor power into a commodity, thereby increasing the use value of that commodity. So, for example, you buy a bundle of yarn for, let's say, $5. You employ someone to knit a sweater out of that yarn, and then the sweater can be sold for $10 because that use value of the sweater is obviously greater than just a bundle of yarn by itself. So $5 has been created in surplus value, which comes from the labor power of the employee.
And he kind of brings up multiple, this actually chapter is pretty key because he brings up, I think, 3 different new concepts, right? First one is the one we just talked about. And the second one is the idea that a lot of people, or at least on the left, kind of understand as the reserve army of capital. And on page 272, he kind of outlines this. He says, the owner of money must find the free worker available in the commodity market, and the worker must be free in the double sense. That is, as he's free as an individual to dispose of his labor as his own commodity, and that, on the other hand, he has no other commodity for sale. So I think this is like a really, really key passage because basically Marx is stating the idea that the capitalists must basically go to the market and people have to be unemployed, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the idea that, if we just had no unemployment, then capitalists wouldn't be able to find, labor to be able to use in their production process. So that's step number 1, is that there has to be unemployed people for this thing to work. And the other thing that he's making, the other point he's making, is that people have to be dispossessed of all other means of production, right? Because if you have the means to subsist, right? If you have the means to grow your own food, or you have the means to build your own shelter, and get your own clothes and all this other stuff, then you don't have a reason to sell your labor.
Mhm.
So you have to be, again, in the position where you don't have a job, and the only thing you have to offer is your own labor. So those are the two conditions that are required for capitalism to work. Is the fact that there has to be this group of people that are unemployed, and the only thing that they have to offer is their own.
Yeah.
Very important.
Right. Yeah. We as individuals own our own labor power, and then we can sell that commodity of labor power on the market. So when you're applying for a job, you're essentially applying to sell your labor for that certain time frame, 40 hours a week. Your labor power is owned by the capitalist, right? If you lack a means of production, your labor power, like you kind of mentioned, is the only thing you're able to sell. If you want to sell a chair, you need wood, you need metal, you need tools, you need those means of production rather to create a chair. And some people, own nothing but their labor power. The vast majority of people in the world are laborers, are workers. Not everybody can be a capitalist. Not everybody can own the means of production. Not everybody can be a CEO, and others, those capitalists own the means of production, essentially.
And again, this is kind of, he kind of uses it as a double entendre, right? Like you have to be free, but you're not free really, right? You're free to just choose which capitalist is going to exploit you. Because
Right.
at the end of the day, we're all compelled to work because since we don't live in a society that provides these necessities, we have to work for them. So we have to,
Mhm.
we are compelled to go to the market and, hopefully find somebody who's exploiting us a little less than everyone. Another thing that I wanted to bring up is he brings up, he starts talking about this concept of social reproduction. 274 and 275, he defines it like this. If the owner of labor power works today, tomorrow he must again be able to repeat the same process in the same conditions as regards to health and strength. His means of subsistence must therefore be sufficient to make him his normal state again as a working individual. So, basically you kind of have to earn enough money and get enough rest to be able to come back the next day and do this all over again. So this kind of, leads into arguments in the present day of kind of a minimum wage, right? Where right now we haven't increased the minimum wage for, I think, the last 10, 12, 15 years maybe, and it no longer provides that kind of level of social reproduction. Like people have to work multiple jobs in order to gain that basic level of subsistence. And it kind of doesn't even completely allow them to engage in this social reproduction, because if you're working multiple jobs, you're also lacking in sleep. So the next day you come into work, your mental faculties are reduced. So it's almost like the capitalists in a way are inevitably going to bite themselves in the foot, because by not providing basic means of subsistence in their wages, in the long run, you are going to cause your workers to deteriorate over time, which is something that Marx eventually talks about very much so in chapter 10, which we'll get to later. But this has real social ramifications. This kind of, what defines the level of subsistence, right? Is a very, very important concept. And then another thing I thought was very, very interesting in this chapter, which I think he talks about on page 278, is that the worker advances the use value of his labor power to the capitalist. He lets the buyer consume it before he receives payment of the price. Everywhere the worker allows credit to the capitalist. So I thought this was like particularly illuminating passage, because there's always this argument that comes from people that own the means of production or capitalists, right? That like, well, I'm putting up all the risk. I'm taking all the risk. I'm putting all this stuff, but who's really taking all the risk? When we go and get, come into these contracts, it's not like every day they're paying us when we give them their labor. They pay us usually bi-weekly. So we take a chance of, like, number one, maybe at the end of those 2 weeks, we don't get anything at the end of it.
There's, sometimes businesses go under, and then there's sometimes no obligation or no way for the company to back pay an employee. An employee could have worked the past 2 weeks and then just not receive that pay. So yeah, like you said, through this commodity of giving your commodity of labor power, you're kind of giving it on credit, the agreement that you're going to be paid by the capitalist later, right?
Eventually, hopefully, right?
Hopefully, right.
That's the whole thing, is that, like, in a way, you're taking a risk. You're trusting the capitalist at the end of the entire 2-week period that you've been giving your use value and creating use values for him to turn around and hopefully sell or use for whatever process that you're going to get paid for. But there's no real guarantee for that. And I thought that was very important. And also the idea that since we don't get paid every day, we are forced a lot of the time, unless you're lucky enough to be getting paid a very, very good wage, that you have to buy things on credit. So it forces you in that 2-week period to kind of go into debt and become, kind of get into the cycle of debt servitude, which is something that has affected our society tremendously with the level of credit usage across the board skyrocket. Most people are not buying things directly using debit cards and directly from their banks. They're putting everything on a credit card.
Yeah, and it's creating this bubble. There's a whole credit bubble happening right now. There's different debt bubbles. I mean, student loan debt is a huge one nowadays, and it just creates these financial bubbles. I did just want to backpedal a little bit, talking more about the means of subsistence. Marx particularly quotes, he says, the value of labor power resolves itself into the value of a definite quantity of the means of subsistence. So I just wanted to reiterate that the means of subsistence can include, the price of food, it can include the price of housing, basically those things that you need to get by, to live. And to backpedal even a little bit before that, labor power is a peculiar commodity in that it's the only commodity that has the capacity to create value, that surplus value. And so if we're selling our labor on the market, then we also need to find a way to determine its exchange value. So that kind of leads into the means of subsistence. And you're talking about, a $15 minimum wage being the absolute minimum. But at the same time, this exchange value of our labor commodity is determined by, it goes back to that socially necessary labor time, which Marx points out that it includes time even outside of working hours. It could be the time it could be the time resting or eating, but to the extent that it includes the time studying, the trade or earning a degree. That's why, you spend all this time in school to become a doctor, and you earn that degree. Then your exchange value for your labor as a doctor is then, valued higher than, somebody who just has let's say a high school diploma and gets, a job at a fast food restaurant or something like that. So I just wanted to point out that labor power is this peculiar commodity that is the only commodity that can create value. And then this kind of leaves us with these two classes, going back to the two forms of circulation. The Cmc circulation, commodity, money, commodity, is only, it only is for laborers who sell their labor as a commodity and then purchase other commodities with money that they get from selling their labor. And then the capitalists operate in the MCM prime circulation. They purchase commodities and they purchase labor power and then sell the commodities for more money. And Marx, points out that this relationship, this wage system, is not natural throughout most societies in history, despite, how natural it seems to us nowadays. To quote him, he says, "Nature does not produce, on the one hand, owners of money or commodities, on the other hand, men possessing nothing but their own labor power. This relation has no basis in natural history, nor does it have a social basis common to all periods of human history. It is clearly the result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions."
I think that's a good place to wrap up. So yeah, next time we'll be talking about chapters 7 through 9, because it's another kind of quick 3-pronged chapter, which I don't know the titles off the top of my head right now.
Tell you right now.
Talking about those, and then following up with chapter 10 and 11 following.
Right. So 7 through 9 includes part 3, which is the production of absolute surplus value. So we will see you then.
Take it easy.